Welcome to Grief Recovery, another Adventist Life Seminar.
Well, I'm so happy you came back to our third session of Grief Recovery, and it's really a pleasure to have you. We gave you an assignment last week before you left, and that assignment had to do with your self-esteem. You remember we said that when somebody very, very close to you dies, you lose somebody very important. It has an effect on your identity. For instance, if a husband loses his wife, he no longer functions as a husband. If a couple loses a child, they no longer function as parents. They lose their identity. And so our assignment served to help you to reestablish your identity. Also, we talked about self-esteem, the fact that when you lose somebody important to you, it always affects self-esteem. And so your assignment was to list your assets and your liabilities, or your areas that need to be strengthened, and then to begin setting some goals, short-term goals and long-term goals. And what we want you to do now is to share with each other in the group how this exercise went with you. We were hoping that it would give you some new direction and help you to move just a little bit beyond your loss. We're just trying to nudge you a little past your grief to the point where you can once again begin living productively. And so if you will now, we'll ask the facilitator to turn off the video machine and share with your group how it went with you. Talk about your assets. Forget about the liabilities this evening. Talk about your assets and share the short-term and long-term goals that you set. Now, maybe somebody in your group will have listed their assets, but they weren't able to make any goals. And maybe you folk in the group can help that individual to set some short and long-term goals using his assets that he has listed. So now, why don't you just push the pause button on your machine and do your group work. Thank you for talking about your assets and liabilities and your goals together. This evening I would like to talk a little bit with you about some of the specific problems I see people having when they go through grief. The first problem I'd like to share with you is a problem of anger. And I think all of us, when we go through grief, do have this problem of anger. Now, don't get me wrong. Each one of us has anger, and anger is just a normal, natural human feeling that we have. But it can become problematic when we're going through grief. I'd like to share with you what I call the 4 A's of handling anger. The first A stands for admit. You know, it's interesting how some people, when they're grieving, are very angry about the death. They're angry about the doctor, the hospital, the nurse, you name it. But they'll never call it anger. They say, well, I'm a little upset. I'm disturbed. I think it's important to admit that you really are angry. Call it by its right name. If you recall, we said that people who are in grief feel confused. They're like a circle with lots of little arrows on the inside, those arrows representing all sorts of conflicting feelings. And we indicated to you in a previous session that we needed to get some of those feelings on the outside, to identify the feelings, to own the feelings, and then express the feelings. And so these feelings of anger that we have in grief, we've got to admit that they are angry feelings, okay? And then we can work with them. The second A stands for analyze. Sit down on it with a piece of paper and a pencil and say to yourself, why am I feeling angry? What is causing this anger? Is it reasonable? What can I do about this anger? How long has it been with me? Just think it through. Analyze the anger very, very carefully as you think it out. And I think this takes a lot of time. Sometimes this would take days to really figure out why you are so angry. And the third A stands for act out. Act your anger out in a way that's characteristic of you. Now, there are some people who will tell you to take a rubber hose and beat a pillow to get out your anger. I'm suggesting that that really is not a productive way of acting out your anger. I'm suggesting that you do something that is productive. For instance, lots of people going through grief will exercise. I know a very dear friend of mine who, when he lost a brother, found that jogging was important for him. You see, anger is nothing but a lot of locked up energy, and exercise is a way of getting that energy out. Some people get their anger out by crying. Other people tell me that they can get out their anger by praying and talking about their angry feelings to God. And this can be very effective. Whatever works for you, and whatever is in keeping with your character, your characteristic way of dealing with things, act it out. And then finally, abandon the anger. Say to yourself, look, I've admitted that this is anger. I've analyzed it very carefully. I've acted it out. Now I'm going to put it behind me, and I'm not going to permit this anger to control my life. Maybe that fourth A can stand for attitude. Really, a lot of what we do with anger depends upon our attitude. Now, if we're talking about displaced anger, then we have to do something to alleviate that, because after all, if we're going to be angry, we want to be angry at the right thing, don't we? And so I think when we're dealing with displaced anger, we ought to think this thing through very, very carefully. And if we are angry, for instance, at the person who died, then we need to talk very carefully about the good parts of our relationship with that individual. We need to talk about the so-so parts of our relationship with that person, and then ultimately talk about the parts of the relationship that were just plain not good. And then as we take a look at the overall relationship, we see that it was really a rather normal relationship. And I find that if people can talk this through very carefully, this displaced anger begins to dissipate. Another problem in grieving is a problem of guilt, and we really need to talk about that. Just as in anger, we need to analyze the guilt. We need to say to ourselves, well, is this guilt unrealistic? Is this guilt caused by unrealistic expectations that other people had of me or that I had of myself? If our guilt is caused by unrealistic expectations, we have to chalk it up as that, unrealistic. Maybe our guilt is really caused because we have violated our own values. And if that's true, then we need to find forgiveness in the way that we customarily find forgiveness in our own life. I find that guilt usually will disappear with talking, expressing, sharing with another person. But if guilt is still hanging around and disturbing you after about 6 months of grieving, I think it's important that you see somebody who can really help you. Another problem is that of estrangement. And this is very interesting to me because there are many causes for estrangement in grief. First of all, in grief we may avoid other people. We may not want to be around them, so we withdraw. And then we feel estranged because of our own behavior. And then there are times when we're disagreeable. I don't like to say this, but I'll tell you it's true. Those of us who grieve are sometimes hard to get along with. And we lash out at people, and people aren't going to come back for a second dose of that kind of medicine. And so they withdraw from us, and we feel estranged. But I think as you work through your grief in your group, share your feelings with the group instead of lashing out at people unnecessarily, this problem of estrangement won't be with you very long. And then the problem of running. We've got to talk about this because, you see, I worked in an alcohol substance abuse unit for a number of years, and I found that a lot of people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs are people who run away from their problems. People who lose through death, through divorce, many other kinds of losses, tend to run away from the reality of the pain. They don't want to go through the pain. They're caught between the urge to run away from it and the need to go through the pain. We talked about the fact that pain by experience mellows. But some people don't give it a chance to mellow. They run and run and run. I knew a lawyer's wife once who lost her husband, and her husband had died something like 5 or 6 years earlier. And she told me, she said, whenever I go back into my house, I can't tolerate that empty place. Those walls just hit me like a ton of bricks. And when I go through the door, the first thing I do is head for my telephone, I call my travel agent, and I arrange a tour or a trip. The last time I saw her, she had taken an 82-day cruise around the world, and she just would not be willing to stop and face the reality of her loss. I hope that you don't run, because it can be a real problem. Another problem is that of premature re-entry into the stream of life. I hope that you will listen to this very carefully, because I find a lot of people want to get back into the swing of things too soon. How do you know you've gone back into the swing of things too soon? If you have to force yourself to do everything you do, from getting up in the morning to going to bed at night, you know that you've gone back too quickly into the stream of living as usual. I'm suggesting that you gradually re-enter into the life as usual. Maybe the first day or two or a week or two, all you're going to do is go down to the post office and pick up the mail, or go out and pay one bill and then come back. You may not go for the whole church service to begin with. You may just go for the sermon and sneak out before the closing hymn. Gradually re-enter into that everyday world after you have lost somebody very important to you. I think then we must talk about shrine building, because I see so much of this going on. I know one woman who lived with her brother for a number of years, and for 6 years after he died, she left the room exactly like it was. The shoes were sitting there just where they sat the morning he went to work, that last morning. The bed covers were still pulled back just as they were when he got out of bed before he went to work that morning. She wouldn't even open the door. She kept it closed all the time. The dust and the cobwebs were thick. Shrine building sometimes is done out of respect for the person who died, but sometimes it is done because the person is just plain not wanting to believe that it happened, wanting to deny it. And then I think, too, that people fear the pain that they will have if they begin to really face the reality. And so they just don't want to go through the drawers and the closets and the shop and the basement and dispose of the things that belong to that person. And so they just leave the things where they were. And this can become shrine building. I'm suggesting, by the way, that you may need some help. You may need some help along the way in disposing of some of those things. Have a good friend come with you, and then as you dispose of those things, hold them, look at them, fondle them, say goodbye to the relationship that is associated with various articles of clothing or machinery or whatever it is that you're processing. But we must talk about this one. People who grieve often expect too much from people around them. I think you'll agree that there is no one person that can meet all of our needs when we are in grief. But sometimes a grieving person will clutch on to one individual and just try to get all of their support from that one person. And it's exhausting to the person that is being leaned upon. It can drive them away. And believe me, you need all the support you can get. And so it's very important that you not lean upon one person, but that you make many relationships and don't expect too much from one individual. I hesitate to talk about this problem, but I think it exists more than we realize, and that is the perpetuation of grief. You say, well, why would anybody want to perpetuate grief? Well, there are some people, you know, who don't have a very wide circle of support. They don't have very many friends, and so when they're going through grief, they get lots of attention. People are coming to them. They're giving them what we call warm fuzzies, you know. They're being touched and caressed, and they have kind, thoughtful words said to them. Food is brought to their house, and flowers are sent. Why, they never had such wonderful treatment in all of their lives, and now they're afraid that if they stop grieving, they will lose that warmth and that intimacy that they are receiving during their grieving process. And so there are some people who try to perpetuate the grief because they don't want to lose that kind of warmth and comfort. I don't think that will be a problem for you because you are receiving a lot of good help here in grief recovery. Now, I think it would be well for us to pause at this point and give you a chance to talk together with your group about the problems that I have mentioned, and maybe you have some solutions that I have not talked about, and there may be some problems that I didn't even touch on. And you might want to talk about these problems with your group and talk about some solutions as well. So we'll ask the facilitator now to turn off the video machine and give you a chance to talk about problems and their solutions. Thank you for sharing with your group. I'd like to talk a little bit about stress control today. You know, grief has a tendency to tighten up our muscles, and it impairs our deep breathing. If you have conducted grief recovery sessions like I have for a number of years, you will remember well the sighing that takes place. The first grief recovery group I had were a group of 14 women, and the sighs could be heard all over the room. And this is because people in grief don't breathe deeply enough. Some people talk about their grief making them feel fidgety and nervous, and it causes them to be restless and sometimes even bored. They become depressed. How do you deal with this? Well, I draw a diagram on the blackboard sometimes with two lines, and then I draw a wiggly line in between. Sometimes the wiggly line drops down below the bottom line, and sometimes it goes above the top line. And this is simply to show that during the course of a day, a grieving person will sometimes be depressed when the line goes down and hysterical when the line goes up. How can we handle this? Well, first of all, I'd like to share with you some things that shrink our ability to cope with life as it comes to us. I don't know whether you've done any reading or not, but there was a study done at the University of Washington by Holmes and Ray that talked about the fact that if you have too much change in too short a period of time, it will cause illness or hospitalization or some other difficulty in life. And this is what I would like to suggest, that if you are going through grief, that's enough of a change in itself. Try to eliminate as much change as possible. We know that people who have sedentary jobs have a tendency to have less ability to cope with things in life. If you have marital stress going on, again, this shrinks this coping ability. If you have a job where you have to meet a lot of deadlines all the time, this also has a tendency to shrink that ability to cope. Boredom, if you have really nothing to do, that shrinks your ability to cope. Smoking does the same thing. People who abuse drugs and drink a lot of alcoholic beverages, you will find that their coping ability has been reduced. People who don't eat well, particularly people who don't eat breakfast in the morning, people who don't get enough sleep, maybe they overwork, have a lot of pressures to achieve, and our materialistic world where we're always struggling to get more things, it tends to make us not able to cope as well. Unemployment, not able to find a job, watching too much violence on TV. All these sort of shrink our ability to cope. But did you realize that grief itself tends to shrink your ability to cope because of all the things that are inherent with grief? Fear, anger, jealousy, resentment, feelings of rejection, discouragement, envy, all of these things have ability to shrink down our coping ability. Well, now we've talked about the negative. Let's talk about the positive. How do you broaden your ability to cope? How do you stretch the coping range, as I call it? Some very simple things I would like to share with you. In fact, they may be so simple that you say, well, Larry, that's too simple. Does it really work? Of course it works. Let me suggest gratitude. Say thank you. It's amazing how if you say thank you, it just seems to relax you, and you can cope a lot better. Did you know that one of the ways that people working in counseling can tell whether or not a person's having difficulty with grieving is if that person rejects and is angry with the person who's trying to help and support. I've known people who have become very angry at sympathy cards, ripped them up and thrown them in the wastebasket, criticized somebody who came to the house just to be helpful and to be kind. The way we can tell when people begin to turn the corner and move toward recovery from their grief is if they begin to appreciate and share gratitude with people who want to help. So, if you want to broaden your ability to cope, say thank you today. Affection. Express your affection in words. Touch somebody. Put your arm around them. Tell them that you love them. Expression of affection is a way to broaden your coping mechanisms. To have joy, to be able to laugh, to be able to smile. There is a certain amount of joy that comes into our life even when we're grieving, and sometimes there's a reason for laughter. This is a good way of stretching your ability to cope. Forgiveness. How much we need forgiveness when it comes to grieving, because there are some thoughtless people who can say some real foolish things and do some real inappropriate things. Why not during this coming week learn to forgive them instead of criticizing them for their not knowing what to do or say? And that will stretch your ability to cope. To have courage, to look at the positive side of life, to have hope stretches your ability to cope. I read one author who said there's one commodity you ought to carry around in your back pocket all the time when you're going through grief. That's hope. Really, you need it. Peace. To be at peace with your God and to be at peace with your fellow man certainly enables you to handle the stresses of life. And then, of course, trust in God, for those of you who believe in God, is a very, very important way of stretching your ability to cope. Now, let me get down to 3 or 4 very practical things that will help you to handle the stresses of life better. One is exercise. I think probably the greatest antidepressant in the world is exercise. It really does help. A number of people in my immediate family have emphasized to me the value of exercise for people going through grief. It does help you to handle the stresses of grief. Relaxation, we'll be talking about that in a little while, but it's very important in stretching your coping ability. And then finally, to have a good balanced diet. Do you know that people who are going through grief don't eat very well? They tend to skip breakfast. They tend to perhaps just fix one thing for their meal. Their appetite is not what it was. And so they tend to be a little skimpy on a balanced diet. And I would say, in general, you ought to have good health habits. It really does help when you're going through grief. But let me underline this for you. When you focus on yourself, it tends to tighten you up. But when you focus on others, it tends to relax. I want to say that again because it's very important. Grieving people have a tendency to focus on themselves. But if you focus on yourself, it will tighten you up, and your coping mechanisms will not work as well. But if you focus on others, it will relax you. It's always amazing to me as I talk to grieving people, when they're able to take attention off themselves and begin reaching out to others, it makes life a lot easier. I wonder how many of you have gone to a bank with a bag full of coins of various denominations, and you've given it to the banker, and he dumped those coins into a little metal coin separator. He shook it, the nickels went down one chute, quarters down another, pennies down another, dimes down another, and they packed them in little paper tubes. Well, you can take a look at stress in the same light. If you take all the stresses, all the stimuli that come at you during the course of a day, and make your mind sort of a separator or a filter, you can determine the way of life that you want to follow. Let me just put it this way. Imagine now that your mind is a coin separator and all the things coming at you during the course of the day, and by the way, those things don't stop just because you're going through grief. They're coming at you lickety-split, okay? This is what you do with them. In your coin separator or your mind filter, you have a great big space called discard. And most of what comes through, you put in that pocket, all right? Then you have a little bit smaller compartment in your mind filter called unimportant. You put a lot of things in there. A little bit smaller compartment, a third compartment, is labeled can wait. And then a very, very small compartment of your mind filter is called vital, things that are really important. Then if you have a very, very tiny compartment, the last one I will mention, you label it top priority. Very few things get in there. But I want to tell you something. You've got to do this to survive when you're going through grief. You've just got to do it. You must determine that you are going to set the pace of your life. I've tried this in a simple thing like separating my mail in my office. I can separate my mail in 3 minutes. Most of it goes in the circular file, and I have just a very few things that I keep that are very important or top priority. So I'm suggesting that you use your mind as a filter during the coming months of your grief, and don't let these things coming at you determine your way of life. You be in charge and filter these things out. I would like for you now to pause in your group and do a little talking about ways that you have discovered are helpful to reduce tension and stress, how you have handled these things that come at you. I've shared a few ideas with you, and now why don't you have the facilitator of your group turn off the video machine and just share for a few minutes some of the ideas that you have found helpful in reducing tension and stresses in your life. I appreciate your taking some time in your group to discuss and to share. I'd like to share now a relaxation technique that I think has helped many, many people in their time of grief. You may think this is a strange thing to include in a grief recovery seminar, but believe me, it's helpful. When you're uptight because of grief, you need something to relax those tense muscles. So I'd like to just share it with you. First of all, you have to prepare for relaxation. You just can't begin relaxing on the spur of the moment. You have to have a desire to relax. You must really want to do it. I also would suggest that if you live in a cold climate, or you're just one of those kinds of people who always has cold feet, that you make sure your feet are warm. That may even require taking a nice hot foot bath and then putting on some slippers so that your feet are warm doing your relaxation exercises. I would also suggest that if you're doing your relaxation exercise in the evening, that you eat a very light evening meal. It's much easier to relax on a light meal than on a full stomach. No intense mental activity, at least a half an hour to an hour before you do your relaxation exercises. And then, of course, you want to maintain a correct posture and do your relaxation on a couch that is fairly firm or a bed that's fairly firm. Some people can even do their relaxation exercises lying on the floor. But before you can do your relaxation, you have to do a little warm-up, and so I'm going to share with you now just a few things that you can do to warm up. And you don't have to do the specific exercises I'm talking about. You may have your own little way of warming up that you already do. First of all, I would suggest that you do what I call a knee lift, and this is very easy to do. 10 times you simply take one leg and lift it up and grasp your knee with your hands and pull it back toward your stomach. Then alternate doing this leg, and you do one after the other. And do it as fast as you want to do it, just to kind of warm you up gradually, okay? Another of these warm-up exercises that you might find helpful is what I call a side nip. You simply take your hand and let it run down one side of your leg and let the other hand go up into the air. Down this way, alternate to this side, down to this side, and do this 10 times. And do it fairly rapidly so that you begin to feel a little warm-up effect. Then you can do a what I would call a partial sit-up. You simply lie on the floor, and instead of coming all the way up, sitting all the way up, you simply lift your head and your shoulders off of the surface that you're lying on. and do that about 10 times. Then you can do what I call a partial push-up. Instead of letting the tips of your toes on the floor and your hands on the floor, you simply kneel down and then simply go forward, putting your hands on the floor, and instead of going all the way down with your chest toward the floor and back up again, you just simply sit back up again on your heels. So you simply go down on the floor on your hands and knees and go back on your haunches, forward on your hands, back on your haunches, forward on your hands. Partial push-up. And that's a nice way to warm up. Another thing you might do to warm up is to run in place. Running in place is a good exercise, and all you do is stand in one spot and pretend like you're jogging. This is a good exercise, and it gets the blood to flowing, and it's a nice warm-up effect. Now, after you spend a few minutes warming up, then I would suggest that you spend about 10 minutes doing what I call identifying stress and identifying relaxation. I want you to learn what it feels like to have tension in your body, and then I want you to learn what it feels like to have relaxation, overcome that tension. So the first thing I'd invite you to do is to lie down on the surface that you're going to use for your relaxation technique, be it a bed or a couch or a floor. Lie down and make sure that you don't have any tight clothing. You don't want any neckties like I've got on here, any belts or tight clothing. Just loosen them. You may have some jogging clothes or something that's relaxing that you can put on. So make sure all the loose clothing all the tight clothing is loosened, and then put a pillow under your knees as well as having a pillow under your head. A lot of people, when they do their relaxation technique, they don't like a very large pillow under their head, just a small one. Don't cross your legs and don't cross your arms. Just put your arms down by your side so that your fingers are not quite touching your side. And then push the problems out of your mind. Tell yourself that this is a time for you to push those things aside, that you'll deal with them at a later point. Now, the next thing you're going to do is to identify tension. And this is the way you go about it. First of all, you will do some deep breathing. Just breathe in and out very slowly and deeply. And then as you breathe in deeply, push your toes as far as you can away from your body. Just push while you're breathing in, real slowly. Push your toes as far away from your body as you can, and you'll feel that tension going up into the calf of your leg. Then as you breathe out, relax your legs. Let your feet come to a normal position. Do that 3 times. Breathe in deeply while you push your toes away from your head, and as you breathe out, relax your feet to a normal position. Now the second thing you do is to push your heels as far away from your body as you can. While you breathe in, push your heels as far as you can from your body. Then when you breathe out, permit your feet to come to a normal position. Do that 3 times, and you will feel the tension up into your legs as you push your heels away from your body, and you'll feel the relaxation. And when you breathe out, just let it all relax. Now you want to do this with your arms and your shoulders and your neck. Just clench your fists and firm up the muscles. Let me just sort of share with you how this works. Just clench your fists and tense up your arms and your shoulders and your neck, and just tense it as tight as you can while you breathe in deeply, okay? And then when you breathe in as much as you can't hold your breath anymore, and you feel the muscles tensing up, being real tight, then just breathe out and let your hands and your arms and your shoulders and your neck relax. Now you can do the same thing with your face. Just purse your lips. This looks funny. I'll do it for you. It looks funny, but it works. Just close your eyes, purse your lips, close your eyelids tight, grit your teeth, clench your jaw as you breathe in. And then when you can't hold your breath anymore, just let it all out. And when you let it all out, just let your jaw drop like this, so that you could take your hand and push your jaw with almost no resistance. Now you do the same thing with your stomach. As you're lying down, you tense up your stomach, your abdomen, and your buttocks, and you tense it real tight while you breathe in. And then when you can't hold it any longer, let the breath out and let the muscles relax in your abdomen and in your buttocks. Now, before you close this part of your relaxation technique, what I want you to do is tense up the whole body at once. Just tighten up every muscle in the body, pushing your toes away from your body, and right up from your toes all the way to your head. Just tense it all up while you breathe in. And when you can't hold the breath any longer, let it out and let your body relax. Now, here's where the fun comes in. During the next 30 minutes, I'm going to have you do what I call deep relaxation. It's very easy. As you're lying there and you feel the tension just leaving your body, you begin to say things to yourself like, "Oh, I feel so heavy all over. It feels like my legs are just going to drop right through this couch. And my head feels like a great big stone just going to drop through this pillow. My body feels very heavy. I feel very relaxed." And then as you feel this body of yours relaxing, just gently, leaving the stressful state, you can begin sharing and repeating some of the bits of philosophy that are important to you. And you may find a text of scripture, if you're a Christian, that will help. Many times when I relax, I like to say the text that says, "I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." And I just repeat that promise to myself while I'm relaxing. And then you may just want to be quiet after a while and just lie there, saying nothing, but just thinking in your mind about something that is very pleasant. And you will really feel relaxed. Now, I'll tell you why I believe this technique works. This technique was shared with me by a physical therapist in the hospital. After I learned this technique, it just so happens that I had a marriage counseling situation coming up at 4 o'clock. And so I told my secretary, "Now look, this is going to be a rough one, and I'm just going to lie down on my office floor and close the door, and I'll be ready to go when my family arrives." I had 1/2 hour before I was to begin the counseling session. I lay down on the floor and I went through my technique of relaxation that I just described to you. And after a while, I heard what I thought was an alarm clock. I reached out to turn my alarm clock off, and I realized I was not at home in bed. I was in my office, and it was my telephone ringing, my secretary calling on the intercom phone saying, "Your appointment is here. They're waiting for their counseling session," and I was fast asleep. So use this technique. It really does work. I think that I would like for you now to think about your assignment for next week. And again, you're going to say, "What on earth does your assignment have to do with grief recovery?" Well, it has a lot to do with it. It has something to do with the fact that you are important, and there's still a lot of you left to share with the world around you. For next week, I want you to be good to yourself. I want you to do something that you want to do just for you, okay? I don't care what it is. Maybe for some time now you have been wanting to buy yourself a dozen red roses. Go buy a dozen red roses. Maybe you wanted to visit a friend 30 or 40 miles away, but you never felt that you could afford the gas at this point to go. Put the gas in the car and drive to see a friend. No matter what it is. Maybe there's a special kind of a pie you have always enjoyed, but you haven't indulged because you're watching the weight. Maybe this week you can have a piece of cherry pie. But do something this week to be good to yourself. I also want you to continue your thinking. Think about the relationship that you had with a person who died. Think through all the ramifications of that relationship, and then keep your journal going And remember, in your journal, I want you to write down some of the pain you're experiencing. I want you to continue also writing down some of the healing that you're experiencing. And express your feelings in your journal. And then I want you to continue talking with somebody about what's going on in your life. And again, if you find that you need to weep, go right ahead and weep. I want you to continue during this week to say goodbye to the relationship that you had with the person that can no longer exist. Keep that going. It's very important. Now there's something else that I'm going to assign that I think that you will find very helpful. A long-term research project has gone on in Boston that has proved to us that when a person is not in touch with his own mortality, and he has never really considered the fact seriously that he too or she too is one day going to die, these people have a very high level of denial. They tend to not accept the reality of their loss as readily. And they found in this research that's gone over a period of about 20 years that if we can elevate a person's awareness of his own death and his own losses in life, the level of denial comes down. And so what I want you to do for this coming week is to go back to the journal that you have kept. And in that journal, you jotted down all of the losses that you experienced from childhood until the present. I want you to list those various losses that you've experienced. And next to that, I want you to jot down what kind of a relationship you had with that person, how close you were to them, and how well you grieved, how well you adjusted to that loss. And somewhere in that exercise, I want you to jot down the time in your life when you first became aware of the fact that someday you too would die. And then I want you to bring this back next week, and we're going to talk about this together in the group. So your assignment is a rather large one for next week, but I think you'll find it helpful. And so may you have peace and may you have prosperity during this coming week.